I want you to picture this moment. A US president stands before the cameras and says, without hesitation, we are taking the oil, not negotiating it, not safeguarding it, keeping it. When Donald Trump announced that Venezuela would immediately turn over tens of millions of barrels of oil to the United States, he wasn't just making an energy statement, he was redefining power in the 21st century. Military force, political control, and natural resources collapsed into a single sentence. I have covered American foreign policy for decades, and moments like this are rare because they are honest, unfiltered, almost brutal. This wasn't framed as liberation. It was framed as ownership, and that should make you pause. If you want to understand where global politics is heading, not where we hope it's going, but where it's actually going, stay with me. This story is not really about Venezuela. It's about the rules of the world being rewritten in real time. And to understand how we arrived here, we need to step back just briefly and look at the system that made this possible. So let's slow this down and be precise about what actually happened. The United States did not simply intervene in Venezuela. According to President Trump, it removed the country's leader, assumed control over its capital, and took custody of its most valuable asset, oil. Between 30 and 50 million barrels, high quality, sanctioned, delivered directly to American shores. This was not presented as a temporary seizure. Trump made clear the oil would be sold at market price, with the proceeds controlled by him to be used, his words, for the benefit of both Venezuela and the United States. Washington, meanwhile, would oversee Caracas until a safe transition could occur. This is the central issue. Not the barrels, not even the military action. The issue is the model. Power enforced first, resources secured second, legitimacy discussed later. Trump openly contrasted this moment with Iraq. The mistake, he implied, was not the war, but failing to keep the oil. Once that logic is spoken aloud, it changes everything that follows. And to understand why Venezuela was vulnerable to this moment, we have to look backward into its slow, quiet collapse. To understand that collapse, you have to separate potential from performance. Venezuela sits on one of the largest proven oil reserves on Earth, more than 300 billion barrels. On paper, it should have been an energy superpower. In the late 1990 seconds, it nearly was pumping about 3.5 million barrels a day. Then the system broke. Mismanagement hollowed out institutions. Corruption drained capital. And as extraction costs rose, reinvestment stopped. Oil fields aged. Infrastructure decayed. Production slid year after year until output fell to roughly 800,000 barrels a day. This matters because oil is not just revenue, it is governance. When oil money disappears, so does the state's ability to function. Salaries go unpaid, services collapse, authority fragments. By the time US forces moved in and Nicolas Maduro was captured, Venezuela was no longer a resilient system. It was an exposed one. History often turns not on strength, but on weakness at the wrong moment. And that vulnerability opened the door to a far more explosive turning point, one that transformed decline into outright crisis. Then came the rupture. Strikes hit Caracas. Power centers collapsed almost overnight. And within days, Nicolas Maduro, the symbol of Venezuela's defiance, was in US custody, flown to New York to face criminal drug charges. Regime change was no longer theoretical, it was operational. But what followed mattered even more than the arrest. Trump did not describe this as an intervention followed by withdrawal. He described control. The United States, he said, would run Caracas until a transition could be secured. And if resistance emerged, he was prepared to launch a second, much larger attack. This was the first mini-crisis because it clarified intent. In an interview, Trump drew a blunt comparison to Iraq. The failure there, he argued, was simple. They didn't keep the oil. This time would be different. The oil would be rebuilt, the facilities fixed, and the oil kept. If you think this sounds shocking, that reaction is the point. Moments like this force the world to confront an uncomfortable question. Is power today still constrained by norms or only by capability? And once that line is crossed, the real mechanisms of control begin to reveal themselves. What Trump revealed almost casually was the mechanism beneath the spectacle. This was not chaos. It was a system. First, remove the political leadership. Second, assume administrative control. Third, secure the asset that makes the system run. Oil was not a byproduct of the intervention. It was the organizing principle. Trump tasked the U.S. Energy Secretary with executing the transfer immediately. Storage ships, direct unloading docks, market pricing. This was not military improvisation. It was logistical planning. And then came the corporate layer. America's oil giants, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, ExxonMobil, were summoned to the White House. The message was unmistakable. The state would seize control. The market would rebuild it. Billions would flow in to repair broken infrastructure, restore production, and restart profits. This is how modern power often works. Governments take the risk, corporations take the upside, legitimacy is retrofitted later. Trump framed this as mutual benefit for Venezuela and the United States. But control over proceeds means control over outcomes. Whoever controls the oil controls the future. And once that mechanism was set in motion, it triggered a second, far more volatile escalation. The second crisis unfolded more quietly but with far greater consequences. As news spread that the United States would not just extract oil, but run Venezuela's capital and rebuild its energy sector on its own terms, the message landed far beyond Caracas. This was no longer about Maduro, it was about precedent. Trump made it clear he was ready to escalate. A second larger strike was on the table if stability failed. That threat mattered because it closed the exit. Once a foreign power commits to administration, withdrawal becomes costly, politically, economically, symbolically. At the same time, the oil clock started ticking. 30 to 50 million barrels were already moving. Storage ships were en route. Every day, forward created facts on the ground, contracts, infrastructure decisions, profit expectations. This is the dangerous phase of any intervention. When force has succeeded, but governance has not yet begun. When decisions made quickly harden into systems that are difficult to reverse, history shows that this is where missions drift, where temporary control becomes semi-permanent presence. And in the middle of all this, between airstrikes and boardrooms, there is a group whose voice is almost entirely absent from the conversation. The people who live there. If you are Venezuelan, this is not an abstraction. It is your electricity, your wages, your future. When oil changes hands, daily life follows. When production is redirected, so is power, literal power. Who gets paid first? Which neighborhoods stay lit? Which institutions survive the transition? You are told this is for your benefit, that the proceeds will help rebuild, that stability will come later. But notice the order. Control first, explanation second, consent last. For years, mismanagement hollowed out your country. Now, external control risks freezing that weakness into a new dependency. Different managers, same imbalance. And if you are not Venezuelan, don't look away. Because the logic being tested here does not stop at borders. It asks a larger question. When a state collapses, who gets to decide its recovery and who profits along the way? If you're still with me, it's because you sense this isn't just news, it's a warning. What's happening in Venezuela is already echoing across the world. Around the globe, capitals are watching this closely because Venezuela is not unique in one critical way. It is resource rich and institution poor, and there are many countries that fit that description. When the United States asserts the right not just to intervene, but to administer and extract, it sends a signal far beyond Latin America. For allies, the message is complicated. Security may come with strings, sovereignty may become conditional. For rivals, the lesson is sharper. Control your resources or someone else will. Oil markets feel this immediately. 30 to 50 million barrels moving under state direction is not just supply, it is leverage. It reshapes negotiations, investment flows, and expectations. When Washington can turn military success into energy control, energy becomes geopolitical currency. And then there is the corporate dimension. Multinational firms are being invited back under a new order, protected, subsidized, and politically aligned. That creates winners. And it creates resentment. Global stability rests on predictability. But precedents like this introduce uncertainty. They blur the line between intervention and occupation, between partnership and extraction. When those lines blur, smaller states recalibrate. Defense spending rises, alliances harden, trust erodes. And once that happens, the future stops being linear and splits into distinct paths. From here, three futures emerge, and none of them are abstract. The first is the optimistic path. US control proves temporary. Oil revenue is transparently managed. Infrastructure is rebuilt. Production rises. Venezuelan institutions are gradually restored, and sovereignty returns alongside stability. In this version, power intervenes, but then steps back. The second is the middle path. Oil flows. Profits are made, order is maintained, but control lingers. Decision-making remains external. Venezuela functions, but never fully governs itself. Stability exists, but dependency hardens. Then there is the darkest path. Resistance grows, governance falters, control becomes coercion. Oil revenue fuels security, not recovery. What began as intervention calcifies into occupation, justified by the very instability it produces. Which path unfolds depends on one variable above all others. Who controls the system, not just the resource? History tells us this lesson repeatedly. When power prioritizes extraction over legitimacy, systems eventually break. When legitimacy comes first, recovery slow, imperfect becomes possible. Venezuela now sits at that fork. And what happens next will not only define one country's future, but shape how power is exercised in the years ahead. So let me end where this story truly begins with you. Because moments like this reveal something essential about our world. Power today is no longer shy. It no longer hides behind euphemisms. When a leader can say openly, we're going to keep the oil, it tells us the age of polite illusions is over. The question is not whether this will happen again. It will. The question is whether we recognize it when it does. Venezuela is a test case, not just of American power, but of global acceptance, of how quickly extraordinary actions become normalized, of how easily control is justified as competence. If you care about sovereignty, about fairness, about the future rules of the international system, you cannot treat this as distant news. You have to see the pattern while it's still forming. That's why conversations like this matter, why awareness matters, why understanding systems, not slogans, is the only real defense. If this analysis helped you see the world more clearly, stay with me, share it, challenge it, and keep asking the uncomfortable questions. Because the next chapter of global power is already being written, and it won't wait for permission.